At 6 p.m., I called my wife to say I was on my way home. She answered on the first ring, stayed silent for a few seconds, then said coldly, "Don't come home. Someone else is in your place. I already changed the locks." She had no idea those words would ruin her life forever. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments what city you're watching us from. My name is Aurelio Tejada Quintero. I'm 57 years old. I'm a public works engineer, and I've been working in Zaragoza since I finished my degree, just turning 22. I'm not a man of big speeches or dramatic gestures. Music, I'm the type of person who arrives on time, who keeps his promises, and music who when something worries him prefers to stay quiet and solve it rather than raise his voice. That's how I was raised, that's how I lived, and that's how, I suppose, I was unknowingly building the kind of silence that others take advantage of. Vanessa Llorente Solano and I met in the winter of 1997 at a company dinner where she worked as an administrative assistant, and I just signed my first contract as a technician in a medium-sized construction company in Zaragoza. I was 30 years old. She was 24. There was something in her direct and blunt way of speaking that seemed refreshing to me in an environment where everyone measured every word before saying it. We got married 2 years later, in April 1999, in a small ceremony with just over 40 people. My parents, hers, some friends of us both. A spring afternoon, with lights still cold, but already without fog. Music in a chapel in the historic center that Vanessa had liked since she was a girl. During the first years, life was exactly what we'd agreed upon, without needing to say it out loud. Both working, building something together, sharing the weight of bills and decisions. When Marcos was born in 2002, 3 years after we married, everything took on a different weight. The responsibility of a son changes how you see money, time, the future. It made me work more. I admit now, with the distance given by the time past, that it also made me be less present at home than I should have been. I'm not saying it as an excuse. I'm saying it because it's true music and because omitting it would be dishonest. There were entire seasons when I arrived when Marcos was already sleeping and left before he woke up. There were conversations that Vanessa tried to have with me and that I postponed without malice. Music, but I postponed them. That's also part of this story. The years passed. Marcos grew up, studied communication, found work at a marketing agency in Zaragoza. Vanessa was promoted in her company until she reached administrative manager, a position that demanded more hours and more travel. I continued on the construction sites, in the projects, in the meetings with municipal clients and concessionaires. That's how an adult life works music when you've been in it long enough. It stops being a story music and becomes a routine. It isn't always exciting. There aren't always memorable moments. Sometimes it's just years passing while you're looking in another direction. That October Tuesday had nothing special about it. I got up at 6:20 in the morning like every workday. I ate breakfast standing in the kitchen because Vanessa had already left. I took the car and arrived at the viaduct site where we'd been working for 5 months with a 14-person team. The day was long, but without surprises. I checked the load calculations of the central section. I had a meeting with the surveyor at noon where we discussed an adjustment to the Pillar 4 anchors, and I signed 3 delivery notes in the afternoon. The smell of fresh concrete and turned earth that I've been feeling on sites for 30 years. The constant noise of heavy machinery as the background to any conversation. Everything exactly the same as always. At 6:15 music, I gathered the blueprints I had on the folding table and told Ignacio Barreda, my site manager for 8 years, that I'd see him the next day. I walked to the car, threw my hard hat into the back seat, started the engine, and as I almost always did, called Vanessa to let her know I was leaving. It was a habit we'd had for years, not a meaning-loaded ritual, simply a practical notice to coordinate if we had to buy something on the way or if dinner was already prepared. I dialed her number. She answered on the first ring. Music that was already different. Vanessa almost never answered on the first ring. She usually let it ring 2 or 3 times, especially during work hours or when she was in a meeting. I said, "Vanna, I'm leaving now. I'll be home in 40 minutes. Silence. Not the silence of a bad connection, nor that of someone finishing a sentence before answering. It was a tense, dense silence, like that of someone who spent time preparing exactly what they're going to say and at the last moment doubts if they're really going to say it. 3 seconds. I counted them unintentionally. Then she spoke, and what she said wasn't a question, nor an explanation, nor the start of any conversation. It was a single sentence, spoken with a calm that didn't correspond at all to what it meant. Don't come home. Music, there's already someone in your place. Don't try to get in. I already changed the lock. And she hung up. I stayed with the phone in my hand, the engine running, the afternoon traffic noise in the background, and an internal silence I wouldn't know how to describe other than as the sound of something breaking cleanly without splinters. It wasn't an inner scream, nor was it panic. It was something more like the emptiness left when you remove an object that had occupied a space for a long time, and suddenly that space no longer has a recognizable shape. I dialed her number again. It was busy. I tried 3 more times in the following 2 minutes. Always busy. On the 4th try, the tone changed. Number turn off or out of coverage forever. Although at that moment, I didn't know it yet. I stayed 5 minutes in the site parking lot without moving the car. I was 57 years old, 26 years of marriage, a paid-off mortgage in the Delicious neighborhood, a 27-year-old son, and a whole life built on something that, as I'd just discovered, had been something else inside for a while. I drove off. I don't know exactly what I expected to find when I got to our street. Music, maybe that it had been a misunderstanding. Maybe that Vanessa had reacted disproportionately to something I didn't remember doing. Maybe that reality would be more logical than that sentence. It wasn't. On the sidewalk, in front of the house's entrance, there were 2 suitcases. I recognized them before I finished parking. The large anthracite gray one we bought years ago at a store on the Paseo de la Independencia, and the medium navy blue one that Vanessa had wanted to throw away the previous year because the left wheel squeaked when rolling. Both stuffed, closed, placed on the sidewalk with a precision that I found almost insulting. Not thrown, placed tidy. Music that was what hit me most in that instant, that they were tidy as if someone had needed them to disappear from the inside urgently, but without losing their composure. I went up the 3 entrance steps, music, and verified what I already knew. The lock was new, silver, without a single scratch. My key didn't go an even 1 millimeter. From inside, on the other side of that door, came the muffled sound of voices. One music was Vanessa's, the other wasn't mine. I stood in front of that door the exact time to understand I wasn't going to knock. Not that night, not that way. Music, I went down, put the 2 suitcases in the trunk, and called Rodrigo Penis, my partner for 12 years, from my cell phone, while the car was still parked in front of my own house. I told him I needed to stay at his apartment that night. Music, I didn't give him explanations. Rodrigo knows me well enough not to ask for them when my tone of voice doesn't allow them. Music, he just said, sure, the key is where it always is. I drove to his house, parked, went up. Music left the suitcases in the guest room and sat on the edge of the bed with my jacket still on. Music, the mattress creaked slightly. It smelled like a closed room, like old wood, and something undefined that wasn't the smell of my house. It was 8:16 on an October Tuesday night. 26 years ended in 11 seconds in a call. She answered on the first ring with a voice I didn't recognize from inside what until that afternoon had been my home. And I, music sitting on that bed edge in silence, began to remember, not with nostalgia, with a cold and methodical attention that until that night I didn't know I was capable of activating, because something had changed in me too in those 11 seconds, something that Vanessa, I was sure, hadn't calculated. I didn't sleep. Music, it wasn't one of those nights when sleep takes a while to come, but ends up appearing. It was a borderless vigil, without any moment where consciousness gave in, even for 10 minutes. I lay in Rodrigo's bed, with my eyes open to the ceiling, still dressed in my work clothes, listening to the building's silence and the constant breathing of a city that didn't know or care what had just happened to me. Rodrigo didn't ask questions that night. Music, when I arrived, I found dinner prepared. A plate of pasta with tomato that he left on the living room table without saying anything, and retreated to his room with a naturalness that I appreciated more than any word of comfort. Rodrigo Penis has been my partner for 12 years, and knows me well enough to know there are moments when the other silence is the most honest way to be present. I didn't touch dinner. I sat in front of the plate for almost 20 minutes looking without seeing, with a fork in my hand and my thoughts spinning on themselves, without finding a fixed point. Then I picked up the plate, left it on the counter, and locked myself in the guest room. The bed smelled like blue fabric softener, the kind that leaves a clean but impersonal trail. I turned off the light. I stayed perfectly still. The stillness was useless. I started to review. Not the big moments, not the anniversaries, nor the arguments you remember because they left some visible mark. I reviewed the small things, the daily things, the type of details that are processed at the time without being consciously filed away, because they don't seem important, but that the brain keeps anyway somewhere where they aren't classified as memories, but as background, as context, as the continuous noise of a life you assume is stable. I remembered a June afternoon. I don't know the exact day, but it was June because it was still light out at 9 at night. Vanessa had arrived late, around 10, with damp hair and the explanation that she'd stayed at the gym with a friend. I asked her which friend, and she said a name, Lucia, which I vaguely associated with a coworker from her office. I didn't give it any more thought. It seemed completely ordinary, but lying in that bed, something about that memory didn't fit. Vanessa didn't go to the gym on weekday afternoons. She went on Saturday mornings, always before 9, without exception. Music had been that way for years. I didn't remember asking her anything else that June night. I simply accepted it. I kept pulling the thread on the weekends of the previous fall, when she started meeting up with friends' music with a frequency that didn't exist before. Saturdays, she spent away from home from noon until night. Some Sundays, too. I was immersed in the Viaduct project with tight schedules and more technical workload than usual, and I took it as something natural. She had her social life. I had my professional responsibilities. That's how a long cohabitation works when each assumes the other is still who they always were. I remembered a December night when her phone vibrated 3 times on the nightstand while she was in the bathroom. I didn't look at it. I'd never looked at Vanessa's phone, not because of any explicit rule between us, but because I'd never had a reason to do it. Or so I thought. Music, I also remembered that in recent months, she'd stopped telling me things from work. It wasn't a sudden change, but a gradual one. So gradual that I didn't register the absence because I was busy with my own affairs. Before she'd mention office incidents, conflicts with suppliers, tensions with a coworker, normal end-of-day conversations. At some point, those conversations disappeared and neither of us pointed out the emptiness. The distance between two people is rarely an event. Music, it's almost always an accumulation of silences that nobody decides to break because nobody at that moment understands that the silence is becoming the very structure of the relationship. Around 2 in the morning, I got up. Music went to the kitchen and drank water right from the tap. I leaned against the counter in the dark. From a window, you could see the deserted street under the yellow light of the street lamps and the asphalt with the damp shine of a drizzle that had fallen while I was locked in that room. I thought of Marcos. My son was 27 and lived 4 kilometers from what until that afternoon had been my home. Music, we didn't call each other very often, not because of any specific estrangement either, simply because each had his rhythm and we'd both accepted it without questioning. The times we met up, conversations revolved around his work or superficial matters that neither of us made an effort to deepen. At that moment, standing in the dark kitchen, I wondered if Marcos knew something, if he'd known something for a while and had chosen not to tell me. I didn't want to go down that path, asking myself questions without any concrete facts at 2 in the morning. It wasn't going to lead me anywhere but exhaustion. I went back to bed. I still didn't sleep. At 4:30, I started thinking about money. I don't know why it was at that moment and not before. Maybe because when the mind assimilates an impact of that magnitude, it does so in layers, and the economic one takes longer to activate than the emotional one. Or maybe because that was when the coldness truly began to settle in, replacing the days with something more like a clear analysis. We had a joint account since the beginning of the marriage. Music, both salaries went into it, and household expenses came out of it. The already paid off mortgage, insurance, and running expenses. It was an account I checked quite irregularly because Vanessa managed the administrative part of the household economy, not because I demanded it, but because she liked having that control and I found it comfortable to yield it. I recognize that carelessness now with a clarity I didn't have then. I grabbed my phone from the nightstand, went into the bank app, and opened the joint account's history. It took me a moment to get my bearings because it had been months since I'd checked it with real attention. When I started reading the movements from the last 3 months, something inside me tensed in a way that had nothing to do with emotion, but with the recognition of a pattern. There were cash withdrawals, not one or two, a series of withdrawals distributed over the months. All for amounts between 800 and 100 euros with a regularity that wasn't random, small enough, each separately, not to trigger any automatic alarm. Constant enough together for the sum to start being relevant. I closed the app, turned off the phone. I stayed still in the dark with that information weighing on me, feeling how it sorted itself out alongside everything I'd been remembering over the last few hours. The gym in June, the Saturdays out, the conversation that kept disappearing, and now music. This wasn't solely a sentimental betrayal. I already knew that since the afternoon before. But at that moment, shortly before 5 in the morning, I began to sense there was another layer underneath, more methodical, older, more calculated than what I'd wanted to see. And that intuition, far from sinking me, did something unexpected. It cleared my mind. When Rodrigo poked his head through the door at 7:30 to see if I wanted coffee, he found me sitting on the edge of the bed, showered and in clean clothes I'd taken out of the suitcases. "Did you manage to sleep any?" he asked. "No," I replied. He watched me for an instant. Then he nodded and went to the kitchen without adding anything else. That was exactly what I needed that morning: coffee, silence, and enough time to sort out what I had before moving any piece. Because one thing had become absolutely clear in that long vigil. What Vanessa had set in motion wasn't going to go unanswered, not out of anger or wounded pride, but because 26 years of work and effort couldn't dissolve in 11 phone seconds without someone, when the time came, being held accountable for it. I didn't have a complete map yet, but I was going to draw it. Rodrigo's coffee was stronger than mine. I noticed it on the first sip, sitting in front of the living room window. While outside, Zaragoza started its engines with the typical slowness of a weekday morning. The sky had that low and uniform gray that in October can stay for whole days without deciding on either rain or sun. I didn't go to the site that morning. I called Ignacio Beretta shortly after 8 and told him I had an urgent personal matter to coordinate the team and that any relevant technical decision should wait until the next day. Ignacio didn't ask anything. We've been together long enough for him to know how to distinguish when to give space without asking for explanations. Then I grabbed my phone, opened the bank app, and started really working. What I'd seen at 4:30 in the morning was just the surface. With a colder mind, even without having slept a single minute, the analysis was different, slower, more methodical, more willing to leave nothing unverified. I went back 9 months in the joint account history and built a mental list of all the cash movements that didn't correspond to any identifiable domestic expense. What I found was ordered with a precision I found almost admirable, though not in a good way. Every withdrawal was under 100 euros. The first was on January 4th, 840 euros. Then one in February, 920. In March, 2 on different dates, 780 on the 12th, 95 on the 26th, April 1st of 1110, May 1st of 1040, June 2 more, July 3rd. August and September kept the same constant pace, without acceleration or pause. I took a piece of paper from Rodrigo's kitchen drawer and added up the total. It took me less than 5 minutes to reach the result. 22,340 euros withdrawn in cash over 9 months. Amounts calculated specifically to slide under the threshold that would have required double authorization. Amounts that fit within the range of ordinary, seen one by one. Devastating when seen together. Someone had studied how much I checked that account and had been right. I didn't check it. I never had a real reason to do it, or so I'd allowed myself to believe. I folded the paper and kept it in my inside jacket pocket. 22,000 euros don't disappear on their own. They go somewhere, they turn into something concrete. Music, what that meant was that the decision to kick me out of the house hadn't been impulsive. Music, it was the end point of a process that had been running for at least 3/4 of a year, executed with enough discipline to leave no visible traces on the surface. I went out for a walk. I needed to move. When I'm still for too long with an unsolved problem, my thoughts spin on themselves instead of moving forward. I walked almost an hour through streets I've known for decades, without noticing the facades or the people, letting my mind work on its own with movement in the background. I started reviewing, not recent months, but further back. I went to the exact moment where, with what I already knew, the story took on a completely different shape. 18 months earlier, in spring, Vanessa started mentioning a name that until then hadn't appeared in any of our conversations. Hector, she named him 2 or 3 times over several weeks, always tangentially, always as part of some comment about the real estate sector or about an acquaintance's company. I paid no special attention to it, because the tone justified none. Music, it was simply a name among others. Then she stopped naming him. That didn't catch my attention either. Names appearing and disappearing in a couple's daily conversation are normal. Music without context, they're a sign of nothing. They only are when you already have the context and look back. The previous year, in September, Vanessa started coming home with a different perfume. Music, the one she'd used for years, was discreet, floral, very recognizable. This one was more intense, warmer, the type of fragrance applied before a social gathering, not at the end of a workday. I pointed it out to her once with the lightness of someone observing something without giving it weight. She said she tried a new one a coworker gave her. I closed the matter right there. I also remembered that in the last 12 months we'd stopped having dinner together more than 3 nights a week, not because of any argument, but because her return times became unpredictable and I'd adopted the habit of eating dinner earlier if I arrived first. That's how things that shouldn't be normalized get normalized without anyone deciding it. I remembered a February afternoon when I walked into the bedroom, and she closed the laptop screen with a quick movement that didn't match the naturalness of someone who has nothing to hide. She looked at me, Music, and smiled. I didn't say anything. The moment passed in 3 seconds and got buried under the weight of everything I was managing that month on site. I remembered that in recent months, she stopped asking me what time I'd arrive. That habit, always naturally present between us, disappeared without either of us pointing it out. I interpreted it as the quiet trust of a couple who no longer needs to coordinate every move. How wrong one can be when deciding to read an absence as comfort. I stopped in front of a cafe on Alfonso Street and ordered a Cordidu, standing at the bar. The facts alone were eloquent. 18 months of accumulated signs that I'd let pass because none separately was enough to build a conclusion. That's what's effective about certain processes. They present no clue that alone justifies alarm. They only become visible when you link them all retroactively with the right info in front of you. What I had in front of me, Music, was a joint account emptied by €22,340 in 9 months. It was a marriage dismantled from the inside with a planning that I, an engineer used to identifying structural flaws in concrete works, hadn't detected in my own house. I left the cup on the bar. There was some coffee left at the bottom. I finished it and went out to the street. I had things to do. The first was to find a lawyer specializing in family law, someone who didn't belong to any circle close to Vanessa or Marcos, who'd worked solely with what I put on the table. Music, the second, was to verify if there were movements the joint account statements didn't show, because €22,000 in cash could be just what had gone through that account. And I still didn't know how many accounts existed. Music, I walked back to Rodrigo's apartment with my hands in my pockets, and that coldness settling in definitively, not as protection, as a tool. I made the mistake of assuming the life built over 26 years was as solid as the bridges I designed, that if the structure didn't creak, it was because it was still standing. Engineers know there are types of deterioration that produce no noise, working from the inside in silence, until one day the structure can no longer support its own weight. I should have known that earlier. I wasn't going to repeat that mistake. I waited 2 days before calling Marcos. It wasn't indecision. It was calculation. I needed to get to that conversation with an organized head, without the most immediate weight of the blow still on me, and I also needed to have made some progress in the steps I'd set out to take. Wednesday afternoon, I asked an acquaintance from the College of Engineers who'd gone through a divorce 3 years prior for references for family law specialized lawyers. He gave me 2 names. I wrote them down on the same paper where I'd added up the withdrawals. Thursday morning, I called Marcos. He answered on the 3rd ring, with that slightly hoarse voice he has when answering the phone before being fully awake, even though it was almost 10. I said his name. There was a brief pause. "I know why you're calling," he said. The tone wasn't that of someone who just received difficult news. It was that of someone who's been waiting a while to have to give an explanation and has decided beforehand he isn't going to give it. "I want us to talk," I replied in person. Another pause. "There isn't much to talk about, Dad. Mom made a decision. She has the right to be happy. She has the right to be happy." The phrase landed with a precision that surprised me. Music not because of the content, but because of the fluency with which it came out of his mouth, as if he'd spent weeks building it. Music maybe repeating it to himself to convince himself it was sufficient argument. "That isn't a conversation, Marcos, it's a phrase. It is what it is," he said. And he hung up. I stayed with the phone in my hand in Rodrigo's room, sitting on the same bed edge where I'd spent Tuesday night. Music outside, the October sky remained overcast, undecided. I called again, which this time took longer to Dad. "I don't want to argue. I'm not asking you for an argument. I'm asking you for a conversation. We're father and son." There was a longer silence. Then he said, "I have something Saturday afternoon. If you want, we can meet before, at 1 in the usual bar." "I'll be there." I hung up. The usual bar was a place near the Plaza del Pilar where Marcos used to meet up with his friends. We'd gone together sometimes when he was a little over 20, and I still imagined weekend noons could be a space for both of us. It had been a while since I'd set foot in that place. On Saturday, I arrived 10 minutes before 1. Music, it was a somewhat clearer day than the previous ones, with a cold clarity that outlined shadows on the cobblestones almost geometrically. I entered the place and recognized it easily. Long, dark wooden bar, small tables with stools, the usual noise of cross conversations, and that particular smell of coffee and beer these places have from early morning. Marcos wasn't alone. There were 3 people with him at the back table, 2 men his age and a woman I didn't know. When he saw me arrive, he made no gesture to get up. He pointed to the empty chair with his chin. I sat down, ordered a coffee from the waiter walking past us. Marcos's companions greeted me with the specific discomfort of someone who's been briefed on someone else's issue and doesn't quite know what stance to adopt. "I thought we 2 were going to talk," I said in a low voice. "They were here when I arrived," Marcos replied. He didn't say it as an apology. He said it as a neutral fact. I tried to hold a conversation during the first minutes. I asked him how he was. He answered with monosyllables. I asked if he'd talked to his mother since Tuesday. He said yes, that she was fine, that she was calm. Calm. I let that word pass without picking it up. Music then, without any specific exchange triggering it. Marcos raised his volume, not suddenly, but with that gradation-contained tension has when it decides to let go. "Look, Dad, I'm going to tell you what I think, because I believe someone has to do it. Mom's been sustaining a situation for years that gave her nothing back. You were never truly present. You arrived late, you left early. On weekends, there was always something more urgent than family. She waited too long, and now she's chosen to live. That isn't betrayal, it's survival." The people at nearby tables had slowed the pace of their own conversations. Not obviously, but I noticed it. That lateral silence that occurs when something in a shared space rises above the usual volume. Marcos's companions looked towards different parts of the place. Music, I didn't answer immediately. I'll let the silence last long enough for Marcos to understand I wasn't going to react the way he expected, neither with defense, nor with justifications, nor with any emotion that'd give him the satisfaction of having hit the mark. "Is there anything else you want to tell me?" I asked with a calm that cost me more than it seemed. Marcos looked at me for 2 or 3 seconds. Then he said more slowly and with a deliberation that turned out music harder than the previous volume, that I don't understand how you can sit here, as if you didn't know how you failed this family for years. Mom wasn't to blame for reaching this point. You drove her. A woman at the next table looked at us openly. The waiter stopped for an instant in our direction before continuing to the bar. I put the cup on the table, took out my wallet, left the exact amount next to the coffee, and stood up without abruptness or theatricality. I already know what I needed to know, I said. Marcos didn't answer. I left without turning around. Music the October light hit my face as I crossed the door, and I walked to the car park 200 m away with my hands deep in my coat pockets. The feeling in my chest wasn't rage. Although from the outside it might have seemed like it. It was something colder, something resembling the clarity that arrives when a doubt you didn't know you had is resolved definitively and irreversibly. Music I sat at the wheel, I didn't start the engine. I looked at the windshield for several minutes. Marcos knew. Music, it wasn't a deduction. His speech in that bar wasn't that of someone who just found out about something. It was that of someone who spent time building a narrative to live comfortably with. He'd chosen a side before knowing the music full facts or precisely, so he wouldn't have to know them. That was his decision. He was 27 years old music and had every right to make it. But decisions generate consequences, and consequences don't distinguish between intentions and results. I grabbed my phone and looked for the first name on the list. Nuria Paez Jimenez, lawyer specializing in family law, music office on the Paseo de la Independencia. I sent her a brief message requesting an appointment for the following week. Then I opened my planner and wrote down in tight handwriting what I'd already decided 2 days ago and what that morning had finished confirming, leaving no room for doubt. Marcos had a revolving credit line with a pending balance of 4,800 euros backed by my signature for 2 years. He also had a personal guarantee linked to his apartment's lease contract, signed when he started working, and the bank demanded guarantees he couldn't provide on his own. Neither of the two ties was going to be renewed. I wasn't going to call to tell him. I wasn't going to send him any message. I'd do it through Nuria, formally and documented, with no room for emotional interpretation. Marcos had chosen his words carefully that morning in that bar. I was going to choose my actions with exactly the same care. I started the engine. The street was full of people moving under that cold October clarity that makes everything more defined than usual. Nobody looked towards a car. Nobody knew what had just happened inside that place, nor what had started to take shape inside me since that Tuesday night. Only I knew it, and for the moment, it was more than enough. On Monday at 10 in the morning, I entered Nuria Paez Jimenez's office on the Paseo de la Independencia. It was a ground floor space with high windows facing the street, furnished with that functional austerity places have where real work doesn't need decoration to justify it. A lightwood table, 2 shelves with files sorted by color, a plant in the corner that seemed to be as old as the building. Nuria Paez was 45 years old, her hair tied at the nape of her neck in a way of listening you immediately identify in people who've been doing it a long time out of professional obligation, without interrupting, without expressing reaction, without letting her face return anything to you until you decide you're done. I explained the situation in chronological order. I started with the Tuesday call and ended with the bank statements. Music I placed on her desk, the paper where I'd written down the total sum, and the monthly distribution of the withdrawals. I spoke for almost 20 minutes without her saying anything more than a monosyllable when she needed me to continue. When I finished, Nuria picked up the paper, read it carefully, and left it next to a notebook where she'd taken notes since the beginning. Music, the first thing I need is for you not to move anything from the joint account, she said. No withdrawal, no transfer, no movement until we have a complete picture of the assets. Is her name on the family properties title? Yes, we're both listed as owners since the purchase. Are there other real estate properties in her name or both jointly? As far as I know, no. But that's exactly what I can't confirm with certainty. Nuria nodded slightly. We'll verify that. The property registry is public. If any recent transfer linked to your wife exists, it'll appear. She paused briefly. The withdrawals you describe have a very specific structure. It isn't the pattern of someone spending impulsively. It's the pattern of someone who planned for months how to move money without generating visible signals. Music that has considerable legal relevance in the context of a contentious divorce. Contentious. The word was exact. I asked her about the estimated timelines for the process. It depends on how much evidence we accumulate and how much the other party decides to resist. With what you're describing between 8 months and a little over a year, she clasped her hands on the table. But before talking about time frames, I need to ask you something. Absolute discipline. No conversation with your wife without my prior knowledge. No verbal agreement, no informal commitment, no economic action we haven't reviewed first. Can you commit to that? No problem. We signed a representation contract that same morning. When I went out to the street, it was almost 12, and the sun beat obliquely on the promenade facades with an intensity that contrasted with the previous overcast days. I stopped a moment on the sidewalk. I breathed the cold air with that faint smell of wet stone autumn mornings have in this city. And I continued to the car with the specific feeling of someone who stopped drifting music and set foot on solid ground. The second errand that morning I hadn't discussed with Nuria. Valentin Corral Esteve was 53 years old and had a discreet office on a side street in the San Jose neighborhood, 20 minutes from the Paseo de la Independencia. I'd located him Sunday afternoon through a directory of licensed private investigators, verifying his credentials in the official registry before calling him. Former Civil Guard officer for 21 years, specializing in the last 9 in civil and asset investigations. His fees were precise and without ambiguous margins. 110 euros per hour of field work with written report included at the close of each phase. I arrived at his office at 12:30. It was a small and functional space with a metal table, 2 chairs, and a window facing an inner courtyard with barely any light. Valentin was a medium-built man with the kind of physical stillness people used to observing for hours without moving have. He listened to me with his arms resting on the table and his eyes fixed on mine, without looking away a single time. I handed him the paper with the withdrawals and explained the essential context. Music 26-year marriage. Abrupt unilateral separation. Joint account with irregular movements for 9 months and a name that had appeared tangentially in conversations 18 months ago. Hector, without last names yet, with nothing more than that name, music, and the certainty that he carried weight in all this. Valentin copied the data into a black-covered notebook in tight, uniform handwriting. "Do you have the family home address you can't access?" he asked. "Yes. Delicious neighborhood. Do you know if the individual in question frequents that home regularly?" "Not with certainty." Music, but the night when I heard voices from the other side of the door. He nodded just once. "I need a week to establish movement patterns. If there's regular documented presence with dates and times, it'll be recorded in the report. If there's any link to the bank movements you described to me, I'll reflect that too. I don't build interpretations. I record facts with documentary support." I gave him the advance corresponding to 15 hours of work. Music, he wrote out a manual receipt with date, amount, and file number, and handed it to me with the same economy of gestures he'd done everything else with. I went down to the street with the weight of the 2 open lines. Nuria for the legal framework, Valentin for the concrete facts. 2 parallel fronts that at some point would converge into something Vanessa hadn't contemplated when she designed every step of this process. What happened 3 weeks later didn't surprise me, but ended up confirming something about Marcos I'd have preferred not having to confirm. First thing on a Tuesday, I received a call from my son with an urgency in his voice I hadn't heard before. The bank had sent him formal notification communicating the early maturity of his revolving credit with a pending balance of 4,800 euros in a settlement period of 15 business days. The guarantee backing that credit, my signature had been withdrawn through Nuria's office with all documentation in order. I didn't answer that call, nor the next 3 that arrived throughout the same day, nor the 2 on Wednesday, nor the text message he sent Thursday afternoon, with a completely different tone than the bar the previous Saturday. I recognized that tone easily. It was that of someone who just discovered the ground beneath their feet wasn't as solid as they'd assumed for years. His apartment's lease guarantee would meet the same fate on its renewal date, which fell in less than 2 months. Marcos would know in due time, also formally, also without any prior call from me. There was no cruelty in that decision, nor any impulse to cause harm for the mere sake of causing it. There was only the understanding that there are ways to support someone that teach them nothing and ways to withdraw that force them to build something of their own. Marcos was 27, had a stable job and the intact capacity to manage his own life without outside backing. What he didn't have was awareness that this backing had always existed quietly without anyone highlighting its value. Now he'd know. And I, on the other side of those calls I let ring without answering, continued with what I had on my hands. Valentin called me the following Friday at 7 in the afternoon. He said he had enough material for a first report and that we could meet on Monday. His voice had no nuance. It was the voice of someone who's found what he went looking for and has simply documented it. I hung up and sat in the living room of Rodrigo's apartment with my phone resting on my knee. Outside it had already gotten dark, and the street lamp's reflection came in horizontally through the window, leaving a strip of yellow light on the wooden floor. 1 week. In 1 week, Valentin had built something concrete over what until now I only had intuitions and numbers about. On Monday, I'd know everything. Valentin's office smelled like printed paper and cold coffee when I arrived Monday at 9 on the dot. He was already seated with a thick folder in front of him, with pages numbered from first to last, with a precision I recognized as the language of someone who learned to document in environments where a logging error has real consequences. He pointed to the chair and started without preambles. Hector Duque Ferran, 46 years old, sole administrator of a remodeling and light construction company registered in Zaragoza 7 years ago, without a criminal record, moderate personal wealth, but with relevant cash movements in the last 2 years. He opened the folder to the first section. First documented visit to the Delicious neighborhood home 18 months ago. On April 16th, a Tuesday at 4:15 in the afternoon, the security camera of the adjacent building's entrance picks up his vehicle's license plate, parked in front of the entrance for 3 hours and 20 minutes. He slid towards me a sheet with a black and white image, grainy, but legible, a parked vehicle, the visible license plate, the date and time stamped in the lower right margin with the exactness of automatic recording systems. From that date until last week, there are documented records on 42 different visits, not all captured by the same camera. There are 3 different image sources depending on the parking angle. On 12 of those visits, the duration exceeds 2 hours. In 4 cases, the vehicle remained parked for over 5 hours. I grabbed the sheet and studied it in silence. The image was clear enough for what I needed. But this isn't the most relevant part, Valentin said. He looked up from the folder for the first time since he'd started speaking. He looked at me with the serenity of someone who's about to say something, knowing it's going to change the weight of the conversation. In the commercial registry, there are 3 invoices issued by Duque Ferran's company in the name of you and your wife's joint account. The first dated February 3rd for an amount of 4,300 euros concept partial kitchen remodel. The second from May 18th, 650 euros concept music living area floor replacement. The third from August 9th, 8920 euros music concept terrace waterproofing and complementary works. He made a brief pause. Total invoiced 20,070 euros paid entirely from the joint account via bank transfer in the weeks following each issuance. I didn't reply. I listened. I requested from the property registry a certificate of charges and status of the family property, which is publicly available. In the same process, I ran a search by owner to verify if there are other assets linked to your wife. He moved to another section of the folder. I found a 73 square meter apartment in the La Almazar district. Until 10 months ago, it was listed as a private asset of Vanessa Llorente Solano, acquired before the marriage. On January 9th this year, a transfer deed was formalized in favor of her sister Dolores Llorente Solano for a declared price of 84,000 euros. He handed me the photocopy of the deed. I reviewed it carefully. The paper had that slightly porous touch of notarial documents, that firmness that makes things written on them seem more permanent than any conversation. How much is that apartment worth in the current market? I asked. Between 135 and 145,000 euros, according to comparable property references music in the same area and similar construction. The difference between the real value and the declared deed price is around 50,000 euros. He closed that section with a clean gesture. The transfer was formalized 10 months before the call you received. The declared price is well below market value, which in registry terms points to an operation with possible simulation of consideration that has a specific legal name, music, and specific procedural consequences. I gathered the sheets I'd left on the table music and placed them in order inside the folder. Valentine watched me without saying anything, with his hands clasped and his elbows resting, with that particular stillness music of someone who's finished presenting and now simply waits. The full picture was this: 18 months of Hector Duque Ferran's documented presence in the marital home. Music, 3 invoices for remodeling work nobody had ever executed in that building, whose amount totaled 20,070 euros extracted from the joint account under fictitious concepts. An apartment privately owned by Vanessa, transferred to her sister 10 months prior to the separation at a declared price that stood no comparison with market reality, and the cash withdrawals I'd already calculated on my own, 22,340 euros. Hector's invoices covered the main part of that amount. The money hadn't vanished into a vacuum. Music had taken a concrete shape. It had traveled a pre-trace path and reached a destination someone had selected with enough anticipation so that at the moment of that call, everything already seemed beyond immediate legal reach, or so they believed. I need all this in a signed report with full documentary support. I said, dates, amounts, sources, numbered images. It'll be ready Wednesday before noon. 3 paper copies and 1 on encrypted digital media. I stood up, shook his hand, and went out to the street. The neighborhood at that time of morning had the calm rhythm of Mondays when the week hasn't gathered speed yet. A couple of older people crossed with market bags. A delivery man left boxes in front of closed bar. Someone swept the sidewalk with slow and regular movements. Ordinary things, completely oblivious to the content of the conversation that had just ended 4 floors up. I went to the car, opened the trunk, and took out the dark blue file folder I'd bought the previous weekend. Music, I inserted the copies Valentine had handed me, numbered them by hand in the top margin of each page, and closed the pressure latch with a dry click. Music, that folder was going to be the backbone of everything that would come later. I didn't think of Vanessa with anger as I put the documents away. I thought of her with something more akin to a cold understanding. The understanding of someone who recognizes the other built for months a plan that seemed solid and invisible to them, executed with enough discretion to leave no exposed flanks, and that, nevertheless, had left traces in 2 public registries. Music in the recordings of 3 neighbors, and in the statements of an account she never bothered to verify whether I checked or not. I closed the trunk. Nuria needed that report as soon as it was ready. With that material on her desk, the process stopped being an ordinary divorce. It became something with a documentary weight the other party hadn't contemplated when designing each of their moves. I started the engine. Vanessa had invested 10 months believing she'd organized everything to get out with no visible costs. She had yet to discover that meticulous order can also be used in reverse, with the same patience and without any noise. On Wednesday, I picked up Valentine's report at his office. 3 copies bound with black spirals and a sealed envelope with a digital storage device. I signed a receipt, saved 2 copies in the blue folder, and handed the 3rd directly to Nuria. That same afternoon, I sat across from her as she read it, watching how her eyes scanned each page with that flat concentration music-competent lawyers have when processing material they know will be useful to them. It took her almost half an hour. Music, when she closed the last page, she left it on the table with a calm that wasn't indifference, but professional containment. With this, the process changes its nature, she said. The invoices link Duque Ferran directly to the asset diversion. It isn't just a romantic relationship. It's documented participation in a fraudulent economic operation with funds from the marital partnership. Music that makes him a party to the process, not a witness. She rested her fingers on the report's cover, and the apartment transfer to the sister with that difference between the declared price and the real value is exactly the kind of operation family judges recognize immediately. I asked her what the next step was. I request a preventive annotation on the family property to block any ownership movement. Then I filed a contentious divorce lawsuit with a complete list of assets and irregularities. Your wife will receive formal notification through the court. She paused briefly. Still no direct contact with her. None. Keep it that way. I left past 6 in the afternoon. The Paseo de la Independencia had that thick movement of the end of the workday. People walking fast with their heads down and traffic advancing in a slow block under a light that was already declining with the typical speed of late October. During the following weeks, I maintained a routine that from the outside was completely indistinguishable from ordinary life. I arrived on time to the site every morning. I checked the viaduct progress with Ignacio. I made technical decisions. I had lunch in the same bar, as always with the same co-workers. In the afternoons, I returned to Rodrigo's apartment, which by then had adopted the practical calm of a shared space, where each respected the other's rhythm without needing to negotiate it. What Vanessa perceived from her side was the silence of a man who disappeared without visible resistance, without emotional calls, without showing up at the door demanding explanations, music without any movement that'd alert her to what was being built in parallel. That silence, I was sure, she interpreted as what suited her to interpret. That Aurelio Tejada had taken the blow and had no resources to answer it. That conviction was exactly the margin I needed. I confirmed it when I received a message from Marcos. The first music since the week of unanswered calls, short with the careless punctuation of someone typing quickly. Mom says if you want to reach a quick agreement, she's willing to talk, that it'd be better for both. Music, I read it twice. I put the phone away without answering. That message revealed more than it intended. It said Vanessa wanted to speed up the closure, that she needed to resolve this before it dragged on over time, that something in the weeks of silence had generated an initial discomfort she sought to eliminate through the shortest route in formal negotiation. Without judicial procedure on the terms she designed. She wanted a quick agreement because a long process was inconvenient for her. On what I'd gathered in the blue folder, I made a long process exactly what suited her least of all. That night, with the window ajar and the cold seeping in along with the street silence, I thought of Dolores Llorente Solano, Vanessa's sister, whom I'd seen in total maybe a dozen times in 26 years. Music, and who'd signed a deed in January without fully understanding what that paper was going to mean months later, when a judge would put it under a magnifying glass that doesn't allow declared prices below real value without demanding an explanation. I also thought, with the honesty only allowed in the dark and silence, music about what I had around me, a friend's guest room, 2 tidy suitcases in the corner, 57 years of life, and a file folder as my only tangible point of support. It wasn't self-pity, it was simply recognizing that this scenario was heavy, that you felt in your back when you woke up, and music in the first seconds before sleeping. The weight of a situation and the clarity to cross it aren't mutually exclusive. That's also part of the truth. 3 weeks later, Nuria called me mid-morning. The lawsuit was ready. We'd reviewed each section together in 2 previous meetings, verifying that every figure had the document backing it, that every date tallied with Valentine's records, that no margin existed for the other party to exploit. I'm filing this afternoon, she said. From the notification, the process is formal and irreversible. Music, one more thing. Duque Ferran will be included as a party with asset liability. It's possible that'll generate quick movements in his circle. If any contact arrives through third parties, pass it to me before answering anything. 2 days after the filing, an unknown number called me at 3 in the afternoon. I let it ring. Then a message arrived from that same number. I am Hector. I need to talk to you. I have nothing to do with the problems between you and Vanessa. Call me when you can. I took a screenshot and sent it to Nuria without adding any comment. I didn't music call him. What that message confirmed was precisely what Nuria had anticipated. Hector Duque Ferran, as soon as he received the notification with his name linked to fraudulent invoices in a judicial procedure, had understood that the consequences extended far beyond someone else's sentimental story. It wasn't the panic of someone who's been discovered in an infidelity. It was the cold calculation of a businessman who sees his company name appear in a court file and understands what that could cost him. Between Hector and Vanessa, Whatever it was they'd built for 18 months, music was starting to fracture at the exact instant the process stopped being a theoretical threat and became stamped paper with a registry date. Structures sustained by shared interests rarely hold up when those interests stop aligning. An engineer knows that before anyone else. I poured myself a coffee, took it to the living room, and sat by the window. The street lamps were already on, even though it was barely past 6 in the afternoon. Music winter was settling in with that characteristic discretion of someone who doesn't ask permission to stay. I opened the blue folder, checked the document order, and closed it. Music everything its place. Every page numbered, every exact amount, every date verified twice. Vanessa sensed something wasn't going as planned, enough to want to negotiate in silence and at full speed, but negotiating requires a position of strength, and hers no longer existed in the way she thought she'd built it. The moment she discovered this precisely was closer than she imagined. The notification reached Vanessa mid-morning on Thursday. She didn't tell me, obviously. Nuria communicated it to me with the usual brevity of someone transmitting procedural data without added emotional baggage. The court's notification service had executed the procedure at the Delicious neighborhood home. Vanessa had signed the return receipt in person, and the date was formally registered in the file. From that moment on, the process had a clock. I imagined that instant, although I didn't dwell on it too much. Vanessa opening an official envelope, recognizing the header, turning the pages with that specific feeling legal paper produces when it contains your name in the defendant position. Music, I mentally saw her eyes scan the sections, the numbers, the concepts, the number of invoices, music, the exact amounts, the cadastral reference of the Almazara apartment. Valentin Corral Esteve's name as documentary source, and further down in the section of parties with asset liability, music Hector Duque, Ferran's full name. That detail, I was convinced, music was what changed the weight of that afternoon in the Delicious neighborhood. Nuria called me again on Saturday at 11:30 with something that in her neutral tone sounded almost like contained satisfaction. Duque Ferran has sent a writ through his own lawyer requesting exclusion as a party to the process. He claims his link to the invoices was of a strictly commercial nature and that any personal relationship with your wife is unrelated to the economic procedure. She paused for 2 seconds. They've also tried to contact this firm to explore an out-of-court solution that excludes him from the file. And I've replied that the procedure takes its course with the existing documentation. There's nothing to evaluate on that point. I hung up and stayed with the phone resting on the living room table. Outside Saturday passed with that slow cadence of November mornings, when the cold no longer surprises anyone, but is still noticeable on the windows, music, and in the behavior of people on the street, who walk faster and with their eyes lower. Hector had taken less than 48 hours to withdraw. It wasn't a calculated betrayal, or at least not in the dramatic sense that word suggests. It was simply what any person does, whose main interest is their own continuity when they perceive that the ground they stood on is no longer stable. Hector Duque Ferran had a company with his own name, a reputation built in a sector where contracts depend on cross-references, and probably had an orderly life outside that apartment that he didn't want any judge examining closely. Music, the difference between genuine affection and interest is this. The former endures discomfort. The latter, as soon as the cost exceeds the benefit, locates the nearest exit without looking back. Vanessa would know it by now, not from any message of mine nor through Nuria. She'd know because Hector would have stopped answering or would have answered with that sudden distance that communicates more than any elaborate explanation. 18 months of constant presence. Music of visits documented on 42 different dates, of invoices with invented concepts, of a plan designed in parallel to a life she decided to abandon, and at the first writ with the court's letterhead, 48 hours to disappear as if nothing had happened. I didn't feel satisfaction for that, or if I did, it was fleeting and left a strange aftertaste. Music, the kind victories have that arrive via paths no one would have chosen. Music, what I did perceive was something clearer. The confirmation that people reveal their true character precisely in the moments when acting with integrity demands something concrete from them. Rodrigo entered the living room with 2 mugs and left one in front of me without asking. He sat in the corner armchair and unfolded the newspaper. Music we'd been sharing that space for almost 5 weeks, and we'd found a balance that required no verbal management, each with his issues, with the other's presence as a background solid enough so the silence wouldn't accumulate weight. I told him about Hector in 3 sentences. Rodrigo lowered the newspaper, watched me for a moment, and raised it again. "I see," he said. That was all, and it was enough. Throughout the following week, I received 3 messages from Marcos on different music days. The first asked if it was true I'd filed a contentious divorce lawsuit. The second, 48 hours later, said his mother was very affected and that he hoped I'd reflect on the consequences. The third arrived Friday afternoon with a different register, more direct and more personal. "Dad, I know you're angry, but this is going to destroy the family forever. There are things that can't be fixed later." I read all 3. I put the phone away. Days ago, I'd have had the urge to reply somehow. At that moment, I didn't. Not because I'd become indifferent to my son, but because I understood precisely that any response from emotion would solely benefit those who expected me to act from reaction, instead of the position I'd built for weeks with a discipline that had cost me more than any of them could see. The things that can't be fixed, I thought, aren't the ones to come, they're the ones that already happened. The systematic planning for months, the money withdrawn in calibrated amounts, the apartment transferred in January, the invoices with services that didn't exist, that has no possible repair. The judicial procedure wasn't the problem. It was the natural consequence of decisions someone made, believing nobody would count them. On Tuesday of the following week, Nuria called me in to review the response filed by the opposing party. Music Vanessa's lawyer, Gonzalo Ferrer-Abad, a family law specialist Nuria knew from the professional sphere and described as skillful, but with little margin when the documentary base is solid, had submitted a writ on time. He argued sustained emotional distance for years, lack of effective contribution to the family nucleus, and progressive abandonment of the marital role as relevant context elements for the asset liquidation. Nuria explained it without changing her tone. It's the argument they use when they don't have a viable economic defense. They shift the focus to the internal climate of the relationship to try to dilute the relevance of the documented figures. She rested her elbows on the table calmly. Music Our Response is going to be exclusively documentary. Every euro has an accredited date, origin, and destination. The effective environment of a marriage doesn't extinguish the asset liability derived from the diversion of marital partnership funds. The judge knows that before I remind him. I asked her if that argument could have any real effect on the final resolution. It could influence the assessment of a potential compensatory pension. Given that your wife has a consolidated career path and stable own income, it's very unlikely to succeed in the terms they propose. She turned to the next page. What they might try is generating minor procedural incidents to extend the deadlines. We have to be prepared for that. I went out to the street with that perspective on me. The possibility of a longer process didn't cause me the uneasiness I perhaps would have expected weeks ago. Something had changed in me during those 5 weeks in a way that was still hard for me to define exactly. I'd stopped measuring time by the urgency to reach the outcome and had started measuring it by the firmness of every step I took. That difference was subtle, but it reorganized everything. Music The November Cold was dry and constant, without wind, the type that settles into the bones without prior warning. I walked to the car with my hands deep in my pockets and my breath becoming visible in the air. Vanessa was alone in a way that 5 weeks ago she couldn't have anticipated, without Hector, with a lawyer using filler arguments, because the substance couldn't withstand any serious analysis, with her sister Dolores implicated from the file. With a process that had all the documentation it needed to get to where it had to get. Music that wasn't satisfaction for someone else's harm. It was simply the result of someone, for the first time in a long time, having decided to count to the end. Winter arrived in Zaragoza with that gray persistence that turns afternoons into something indistinguishable from nights. December advanced with the dry coldness characteristic of the Ebro Valley, without rain, without snow, with a horizontal cold that entered through any crack and settled without prior warning. Music. It was in the second week of December when Vanessa tried to contact me directly for the first time since that October afternoon. It wasn't through Marcos or any intermediary. It was a message sent from her own number at 9:15 on a Wednesday morning, with a restraint in tone I recognized immediately as the product of having rewritten it several times before sending it. Music. Aurelio, I need us to talk. There are things we can resolve between us without needing to continue down this path. Call me when you can. I forwarded it to Nuria the instant I finished reading it. Her reply arrived 10 minutes later. Don't reply. Any communication must go through this office. 3 days later, a formal writ from Vanessa's lawyer, Gonzalo Ferreira Bad, arrived at Nuria's office. The proposal was the following. Vanessa acknowledged the irregular bank movements and committed to restoring the 22,340 euros within 90 days. In exchange, she requested that Hector Duque Ferran be excluded from the procedure and that the Almazara apartment issue be resolved via private agreement with joint valuation. Nuria presented it to me at the Friday meeting with a single sentence of context. It's a proposal from someone who already knows she doesn't control the process. I asked for her technical assessment. Returning the money, now music, doesn't extinguish the liability for the documented irregularity. The judge has the evidence and authority to evaluate it regardless of a late return. As for the apartment, the private agreement route would precisely eliminate judicial supervision over the operation's real value. It's what they're most interested in avoiding. She ordered the papers with a clean gesture. My recommendation is to reject without a counterproposal. The response left the office that same Friday afternoon. What followed, I learned in early January, when the file received the result of the expert appraisal of the Almazara property. The court-appointed expert had established the apartment's market value at 138,000 euros. The declared price in the transfer deed in favor of Dolores Llorente Solano was 84,054,000 euros difference between the certified real value and the deeded price. The judge issued a provisional resolution declaring sufficient evidence of business simulation and ordered the annotation of suspension of the registry inscription until the final resolution of the process. In practical terms, the apartment was blocked. Dolores couldn't sell, mortgage, or dispose of it in any way while the procedure was active. Nuria explained the scope to me with her usual precision. If the judge confirms the simulation in the final resolution, the transfer is annulled and the property returns to the marital inventory for its liquidation. Your sister-in-law will have been part of a process with registry consequences that directly affect her. The sister who signed believing she was doing a discreet favor was beginning to understand that discretion has limits, which public registries don't respect. All this was happening while the city followed its December rhythm with total indifference. The lights on the Paseo de la Independencia, the smell of chestnuts from the corners, music people moving with bags between lit shop windows, the outside world with no interest in what was being processed in offices and rooms a few streets away. It was also in that period when Marcos' situation started to have visible economic weight. His lease contract's guarantee had reached its renewal date. The notification of the end of the guarantee had left Nuria's office with the same formality as the revolving credit 2 months prior. Marcos needed to present a new guarantee or negotiate conditions with the owner. With the credit in the liquidation process and no paternal guarantee, his profile with any financial institution had changed category. I wasn't glad about that. I say it with the same honesty with which I've told everything else. There was no pleasure in me knowing my son faced concrete difficulties. What there was the conviction that indefinitely sustaining backing that someone doesn't acknowledge and uses to reinforce a position that directly harms isn't generosity. It's financing one's own harm with money and silence. One Sunday in mid-December, Marcos showed up unannounced at the site. It was late, with the light already very low, even though it was barely past 4. Ignacio notified me from the entrance that someone was waiting by the access. I saw him from a distance. He was with his hands deep in the pockets of a jacket insufficient for that temperature, and an expression that had nothing to do with the one from Saturday at the bar. That one had been arrogance, disguised as conviction. This was something else. It was the face of someone who spent weeks discovering that the consequences they thought abstract have specific direction and weight. I approached without rushing. "You didn't have to come all the way here," I said. "You don't pick up the phone." "It isn't the phone, it's the timing and the manner." He kept silent for a few seconds. Then he said with a lower voice than that noon, and without a trace of the volume from then, "Music, I'm having problems with the apartment. The bank won't cover the guarantee, and the landlord has given me a deadline." I didn't answer immediately. "I know what you're going to tell me," he added. "You don't know what I'm going to say because I haven't said it yet." I looked at him. He was my son with my same features softened by his generation and by years of a life built on a ground, whose solidity he'd never had to verify because it was always there, without visible cost. That was the central problem, and having him in front of me that December afternoon didn't dissolve it. "I'm not going to resolve it this afternoon, Marcos, nor this week. You have steady work and the capacity to manage it on your own." I paused briefly. What happened in that bar doesn't disappear with a guarantee, and what's happening with your mother doesn't change because you need it to. Music, he opened his mouth, he closed it. I turned toward the site without adding anything else. I didn't turn around. I heard his footsteps moving away toward the car and the sound of the engine starting a minute later. The evening cold closed over the viaduct's concrete skeleton, over the motionless cranes, over the silence of sight that at that hour no longer had anyone else inside. I spread the blueprints on the folding table and continued with what I had pending. January would arrive soon, and with it the hearing. The hearing was set for January 14th, Tuesday, at 10 in the morning. I arrived at the judicial building on the Paseo de la Constitución 20 minutes early. The January cold was different from the preceding months, denser, more horizontal, with a dry wind coming down from the north that made any metal surface burn upon music contact. I entered the lobby, greeted Nuria, who was already reviewing documents on a wooden bench, and sat next to her without saying anything unnecessary. She had the main file folder in front of her and two lateral binders sorted by sections. Her posture was the usual one, a productive stillness that didn't change tone regardless of what was happening around. "Did you rest?" she asked without looking up. "Enough." "Good." She closed the binder. "I'll go in. You listen. If the judge directs any direct question to you, music, answer only what you're asked. Without expanding, without qualifying, without adding anything you haven't been asked." I nodded. At 10:05, we entered the music room. It was a functional space with cold lighting and air that smelled like paper and forced heating. That dry heat that produces dryness in the throat. A few minutes later, I saw Vanessa at the back, sitting next to Gonzalo Ferreira Bad. She didn't look at me when I walked in. She kept her eyes fixed on the papers in front of her with a concentration that seemed costly, like someone who needs an object to rest their eyes on so as not to meet anyone else's. Music, I saw her differently. She wasn't the woman who answered the phone in October with that freezing calm. She was music, someone who'd been managing a situation for months that had stopped responding to her calculations, and that has a physical cost that settles in the posture, in hand gestures, in the way of occupying a chair. I'm not saying it with any specific intention. I'm saying it because it was visible. Music Judge Rafael Domingo Sanz entered right at 10, age close to 60, thin-framed glasses, economy of movement suggesting many years on that bench. He sat down, briefly reviewed the papers, and declared the hearing open. Nuria took the floor, presented the case with the same structure she'd given all her writings, from the most concrete facts towards the conclusions, without ornament, without emotional emphasis. With the precision of someone who knows the material speaks for itself, and that any rhetorical embellishment music only dilutes its weight. She started with the withdrawals timeline. She projected the chart made from the statements, 16 cash movements distributed between January and September, all under €100 with a regularity any eye distinguishes from an ordinary spending pattern. Total sum, €22,340 music. Then she moved to the invoices, placed the 3 copies before the judge, and explained them one by one. Issuance date, music declared concept, exact amount. Payment date from the joint account. Next, she presented the technical report from a registered architect. After visual inspection of the Delicious neighborhood property, no element existed that accredited kitchen remodeling, floor replacement, or waterproofing work on the indicated dates. The installations corresponded to interventions over 8 years old. The invoice concepts had no physical correlate, 20,070 euros charged for works that hadn't existed. The judge took notes without looking up. Nuria continued with Valentine's material. 42 records of Hector Duque Ferran's vehicle's presence music in front of the marital home over 18 months with individualized dates, times, and image sources. She made no interpretive comment. She deposited it before the judge and moved forward. Music she unfolded the Almazura apartment deed next to the expert appraisal certificate. Music certified real value 138,000 euros, declared deed price 84,000. Difference 54,000 euros, transfer date January 9th, 10 months prior to the separation. And then she pulled out the last document. It was the consultation log to Gonzalo Ferrer Abad's office. Music obtained through procedural diligence. Vanessa Urente Solano had consulted that same lawyer regarding marital separation in March, 7 months before that October call. The attorney-client relationship had begun while both lived under the same roof, while the withdrawals continued to occur, while the invoices hadn't yet been fully issued. That wasn't a reaction to a breakup. It was the planning of one. The judge looked up from his notes for the first time since Nuria had begun. He held his gaze on the documents for a moment before noting something with an underlined stroke. Ferrer Abad Music used his turn to reiterate the known arguments. Sustained emotional distance, lack of effective reciprocity, progressive deterioration of the marital bond. He spoke for 12 minutes. The judge listened with the same neutral expression as before. When Ferrer Abad concluded, the judge asked 2 technical questions about bank movement dates and the exact moment of the expert appraisal. Nuria answered with the documents in hand and the exact page reference. He didn't ask me anything directly. The hearing lasted 85 minutes in total. We went out to the hallway. Nuria gathered her binders, and we walked to the street without speaking yet. Outside, the January wind continued with the same dry insistence as earlier. "How do you see it?" I asked. She chose her words carefully. The timeline of previous legal consultations is the element carrying the most weight. It establishes premeditation with documentation originating externally to our side. That isn't easily refuted. She adjusted the binders under her arm. "Wait for the resolution." We said goodbye in front of the building. I walked to the parking lot through streets I knew by heart, but that morning had a different texture, like places you contemplate for the last time, with a perspective that music previously wasn't available. The resolution arrived 22 days later. Nuria called mid-afternoon. Her voice had something that, for the first time, wasn't strictly neutral, something closer to the contained satisfaction of someone who's built carefully and verifies the structure holds. The judge had ruled documented asset diversion in the amount of 22,340 euros, full restitution charged against Vanessa Urente Solano's private assets. Invoices for 20,070 euros recognized as operations without real correlation, included in the liabilities charged to the defendant. Transfer of the Almazura apartment declared void for simulated consideration. Property reintegrated into the marital inventory for liquidation. Full procedural costs charged to the defending party. Music I listened to each point standing by the window, staring at the street, where the January afternoon was already darkening quickly. "Thank you," I said when Nuria finished. "It's been an organized job, and that has its result." I hung up. Outside, the street lamps turned on suddenly with that electric click you only hear when the silence around you is complete enough. The street was bathed in a uniform yellow light that equalized the facades, the cars, the cold asphalt. 22,340 euros the apartment, the costs, everything someone had moved, believing the order of things wasn't going to register it. It had registered every step, every date, every euro. The days following the resolution had a texture I didn't expect. It wasn't immediate relief, nor the clean satisfaction you imagine when you've been working for months towards a concrete result. It was something more gradual and stranger. The feeling that the weight carried for months didn't disappear at once, but was changing its nature, slowly transforming into something that no longer squeezed the same way. The first days were full of procedures. The marital asset liquidation required deadlines coordination between Nuria and the appraiser, appointed to value the Delicious neighborhood property. The Almazara apartment, reintegrated into the inventory by judicial resolution, would enter that same process along with the rest of the common assets. The numbers were clear, and the procedure, although it required time, no longer had any ambiguity about its direction. Vanessa left the family home in February. There was no direct communication between us. The coordination was exclusively between lawyers with the coldness of procedures that have stopped having room for personal interpretation. Nuria informed me of every advance with the same brevity as always, and I responded with the same discipline maintained since the beginning. Music without emotional comments, without any movement outside what was agreed. The Delicious neighborhood apartment was put up for sale in spring. The appraisal placed it at €342,000. Music, the half, corresponding to my share in the marital partnership, added to the reimbursement of the diverted money and the proportional part of the Almazara apartment's value, made up a result that would never have existed if I'd accepted the silent agreement proposal Vanessa sent in December through her lawyer. There are decisions that justify themselves over time. In March, I rented a place in the Las Fuentes neighborhood 3 streets from the market, with a large window facing a square where there was a tree in the center that still had no leaves, but already hinted at spring in its branches. It was a 45 square meter space with white walls and a light wood floor that creaked slightly on the right side. I furnished it with strictly the necessary: a work table, 2 chairs to receive clients, a shelf for blueprints and folders, and a small coffee maker on a built-in counter. I left just as it was when I found it, because I liked its unfinished look. Tejada, engineering, music with no other name than mine. The first months brought minor projects, technical consulting, expert reports for law firms through College of Engineers contacts, a site consultancy for a suburban housing cooperative. It wasn't the volume I'd managed for years at the big company, but it had something that didn't have. Every decision depended solely on my judgment. That value is only appreciated when you've spent enough time without it. Rodrigo remained Rodrigo. When I finally moved to a rented apartment in the San Pablo neighborhood in early March, he helped me load the suitcases into the car with the same economy of gestures as always. At the door, before driving off, he said just one thing: "Music, it was about time you had your own place." He was right, although neither of us delved into that. The apartment was small and enough. 2 bedrooms, a kitchen with a window to the inner courtyard, and a living room with just space for what's necessary. During the first week, it smelled like new paint. Then it started to smell like coffee in the mornings and warm wood when the afternoon sun came through the window. It started smelling like an inhabited place, music like my place. I slept well for the first time in many months. It was in July when Marcos called. It was 8:20 in the evening. Music, I was at the office finishing a foundation report for the cooperative project, with the window open and the square's noise coming in softly along with the heat that hadn't yielded yet. I saw his name on the screen and let it ring twice before answering. "Dad," music, Marcos. There was a brief pause loaded with the weight of the elapsed months without any real contact. "How are you?" he asked. "Fine, working. I heard you set up your own office." "Yes." Another pause. I heard him breathe before continuing. "Music, I've had difficult months. With the apartment, with the bank. I've had to resolve many things." Alone, I didn't answer immediately. I let the sentence occupy the space it needed. "I know," I said after a few seconds. "I wanted to ask you if we could see each other someday, without tension, just talk." I rested my pen on the report and looked at the square through the window. There were a couple of people sitting on the bench by the tree, which by then already had green and dense leaves. An older lady with a shopping bag, music, a young man with his phone in his hand, the square completely oblivious to what was being said 4 meters from it. I can listen to you, Marcos, but you need to understand something first. I chose my words carefully, without harshness, but without ambiguous margin. What happened in that bar isn't resolved with time or with a conversation. Not because I haven't processed it, but because what you said with incomplete info music and with a voice volume you chose deliberately. That's also part of the facts. Silence on the other side. I'm not telling you we can't talk. I'm telling you any conversation between us from now on starts from a different place than before. There's no return to the previous point. That isn't a punishment. It's simply how consequences work when decisions carry real weight. I heard a music breathe. I understand, he said finally. His voice was lower than at the beginning of the call, without the defensive register of other times. Whenever you want to talk, call ahead of time. We'll set a day and talk. I paused briefly, but don't expect to find the same guy as before. That one doesn't exist anymore. All right, he said. I hung up. I went back to the report. Music the cooperative building's foundations required a ribbed slab, solution, music I'd been analyzing for half an hour before the call. I resumed the calculations from where I'd left them, with the square's noise in the background and the July lights still alive on the roof of the building across the street. I felt no agitation after hanging up, nor coldness. Music, it was something more like the serenity of someone who's finished clarifying something that had been waiting a while to be resolved. Without drama and without more words than necessary. Marcos would have to build from scratch the relationship he wanted to have with me, if he wanted it. I wasn't going to facilitate that path nor obstruct it. I simply was no longer going to be the invisible ground that had always existed without anyone noticing. Music, we'd both lost that, albeit for different reasons and from completely different positions. I turned off the computer at 10:15. I gathered the blueprints, left the folder on the shelf, and washed the mug in the small sink on the counter. I turned off the office light and locked the door. The square was almost empty at that hour. The center tree cast a long shadow on the cobblestones under the street lamp's light. I walked to the car slowly, with my hands free and no pending weight beyond tomorrow's work. 57 years old, a new life with the same last names and a completely different starting point. Sometimes I think about that October call, about the 3 seconds of silence before Vanessa spoke, about the voice I didn't recognize, about the 11 seconds she took to say what she said and hang up. For 26 years, we shared a table, a roof, the same threshold every morning. Music in the truest sentence that came out of her mouth in all that time was the last one, short, without a name, without any effort to soften what she was doing. That sentence took everything from me in an instant, and in that same instant, without either of us knowing it yet, returned everything to me too.